Hello, and welcome to Medieval Nocturnes. Tonight, we're peeling back the gilded layers of a civilization known for its stoic pyramids and rigid order, to uncover its surprisingly vibrant and, shall we say, expanded consciousness. We're journeying down the Nile into the world of ancient Egyptian recreational chemistry, where sacred rituals and divine communion often came with a little something extra. Before you get too comfortable and drift away, if you enjoy these quiet explorations into the past, please consider subscribing to our channel. It helps us continue to create this content for you. Now, find a comfortable position, dim the lights, and let the whispers of history carry you toward sleep. When you picture ancient Egypt, you likely imagine colossal statues staring blankly into the desert, perfectly aligned pyramids pointing to the heavens, and a society governed by divine pharaohs and unwavering cosmic balance. It's an image of stone, gold, and solemnity. But beneath that carefully constructed veneer of order was a culture that deeply understood the power of altered states. They believed the veil between the mortal world and the divine was thin, and they had a whole apothecary of sacred plants and potions to help them peek through it, not just for priests, but for everyone. Our journey begins with the most iconic of these sacred botanicals, the blue lotus flower. You've seen it countless times in the art they left behind, etched into tomb walls and painted on papyrus scrolls. Elegant pharaohs and graceful queens hold the delicate blue and gold flower to their noses. Party guests exchange them at lavish banquets, and gods offer them as a divine gift. But this was far more than a simple decoration or a pretty perfume. It was Egypt's favorite way to get just a little bit closer to the sun god, Ra. The method of preparation was elegantly simple, a piece of chemistry accessible to both the noble and the commoner. The delicate sun-dried petals of the blue lotus were submerged in large clay amphorae filled with wine. There, they would steep for hours, sometimes even days, slowly releasing their psychoactive compounds into the fermenting grape juice. This floral infusion was the drink of choice at religious festivals, elaborate banquets, and sacred ceremonies, turning an ordinary gathering into a hazy, dreamlike experience. The effect of this lotus-laced wine wasn't a wild, disorienting trip. Instead, it was described as a soft, gentle euphoria, a serene and floaty sensation that took the sharp edges off of reality. It wouldn't make you forget your name or see talking crocodiles, but it was just enough to make the endless temple chants sound melodious and the prospect of hauling another limestone block for a pyramid feel like a fun, collaborative, team-building exercise. It was a divine mood enhancer, a social lubricant blessed by the gods themselves. Crucially, the Egyptians didn't view this experience through the modern lens of getting high. To them, it was a sacred act of spiritual communion. The blue lotus was inextricably linked to creation myths and the cycle of rebirth. The flower closes its petals at night and sinks below the water, only to re-emerge and bloom again with the morning sun, mirroring the daily journey of the sun god Ra. To ingest the flower was to partake in this cosmic cycle, to symbolically inhale a piece of divinity and bring oneself closer to the eternal. This reverence is why the blue lotus appears everywhere in their culture. It's not just in the hands of the living. It was a crucial accessory for the dead. Wreaths and garlands of blue lotus petals were draped over mummies and left in tombs, ensuring the deceased had a ready supply for their journey through the underworld. The prevailing logic seemed to be that if eternity was going to be a long trip, it was best to travel well-stocked and in a pleasantly calm state of mind. It was both a spiritual necessity and the ultimate form of practical planning. If the gentle floatiness of Blue Lotus wine was the ancient Egyptians' way of dipping a toe into the divine, their other festivals were a full-body plunge. There are religious holidays dedicated to quiet contemplation, and then there is the ancient Egyptian Feast of Drunkenness. The name isn't a metaphor, nor is it a subtle hint. It is a literal, unapologetic description of the main event, a state-sanctioned annual party where the primary goal was to get completely, literally, and divinely obliterated in the name of cosmic balance. The festival revolved around the fearsome goddess Sekhmet, a lion-headed deity of war and destruction. According to myth, the sun god Ra, disgusted with humanity's disobedience, sent Sekhmet to punish them, slaughtering mortals by the thousands until the fields ran red with blood. By the thousands, until the fields ran red with blood. Realizing he may have overreacted, Ra tricked the bloodthirsty goddess by dyeing thousands of jars of beer red and pouring it all over the land. Sekhmet drank it all, passed out, and awoke as the gentle, loving goddess Hathor. Mankind was saved from total annihilation by, essentially, a divinely orchestrated blackout. To commemorate this heroic act of celestial intoxication, Egyptians gathered once a year to reenact it. The ritual wasn't just encouraged, it was a sacred duty. Priests would dispense enormous quantities of beer and wine, urging revelers to drink to their heart's content. This was less of a friendly suggestion and more of a spiritual dare. The aim was to drink until you entered a trance-like state, shedding your earthly inhibitions to commune directly with the goddess. It was theology meets a citywide pub crawl, and everyone was invited. The scene was one of controlled chaos. Throughout the temples and streets, music from lutes, harps, and tambourines filled the air. People would dance, sing, and clap, their movements growing looser and more erratic as the day wore on. The goal was to achieve a state of religious ecstasy, which often looked suspiciously like collapsing in a courtyard, surrounded by strangers hiccuping praises to the gods. Whether the visions people reported were of Hathor herself, or simply the bottom of a clay jug was, spiritually speaking, irrelevant. But this was not merely an excuse for debauchery. At its core, the Feast of Drunkenness was a profound religious ceremony. It was a ritual of renewal, designed to honor the dual nature of the divine, the terrifying destroyer and the benevolent creator. By embracing total chaos and intoxication, participants symbolically purged their fears and anxieties, ensuring the destructive aspect of the goddess was pacified for another year. They would wake the next day with a pounding headache, perhaps a few new regrets, but also with their souls ritually cleansed and the world thankfully intact. Now, we need to talk about the fuel for these grand festivals, the lifeblood of Egyptian society, beer. But it's crucial that you forget everything you know about the crisp, golden, bubbly beverage of the modern world. Ancient Egyptian beer was less of a refreshing drink and more of a fermented, drinkable porridge, served thick, opaque, and with a consistency that would deeply confuse both a bartender and a nutritionist. This was not a beverage for savoring. It was a beverage for surviving. The creation process began not with hops and barley, but with bread. Loaves of nutrient-rich, emmer wheat or barley were partially baked, leaving the inside doughy and full of active yeasts. These bread loaves were then crumbled and soaked in water, inside large ceramic vats, where they were mashed by hand or foot into a lumpy, soupy stew. Left to ferment in the open air, the mixture would slowly transform into a thick, slightly sour, and mildly alcoholic slurry that was more akin to liquid bread than anything you'd pour from a tap today. This concoction, known as henket, was a cornerstone of the Egyptian diet, consumed by everyone from the pharaoh in his palace to the farmer in his field, and even by children. In a world where drinking water straight from the Nile could be a death sentence due to parasites and bacteria, beer was the safer, more reliable option. The boiling involved in making the bread and the fermentation process itself killed off most harmful microbes, making it a source of clean hydration and, more importantly, calories. It was a food group in a jug. Of course, in keeping with Egyptian tradition, beer was rarely just beer. While the daily brew for laborers was plain, the beer served at temples and festivals was often intentionally altered. Priests and brewers became experimental mixologists, enhancing their batches with honey, dates, spices, and a variety of potent herbs. If you wanted to commune more deeply with the gods, or perhaps just forget about the blistering desert heat, a little mandrake root or other psychoactive plants might be added to the mash, turning your daily meal into a divine experience. This liquid bread was so essential that it became a form of currency. The great pyramids, temples, and tombs were not built on the back of gold coins, but on a steady supply of bread and beer. State laborers received a daily ration of several liters of the thick brew, meaning the master craftsmen and workers hauling massive limestone blocks were likely fueled by a persistent, low-grade buzz. Let that sink in the next time you feel unproductive after a single cup of coffee. An entire civilization was built by a workforce that was perpetually and officially buzzed. So imagine yourself there, sitting by the Nile after a long day's work. You aren't cracking open a cold one. Instead, you're dipping a reed straw, likely equipped with a filter at the end, into a communal ceramic pot, trying to suck up the viscous beige fluid while avoiding the larger chunks of soggy bread. The taste was probably forgettable, but in a world of sand, sun, and crocodiles, a lukewarm jar of boozy oatmeal wasn't just a drink, it was civilization itself. Now that you've been spiritually cleansed by beer and wine, it's time to change the very air you breathe. We move from ingestion to inhalation into the sacred smoke of the temple. But this wasn't the simple scent of a single burning resin. This was kaifi, the legendary temple incense of ancient Egypt. A complex perfume so potent it was said to lull the soul, pacify the gods, and leave entire temple complexes smelling like a divine bakery that had caught fire. Kaifi was not a simple product. It was a masterful work of sacred alchemy. The recipes were closely guarded secrets, passed down through generations of priests, but historical texts give us a glimpse into their complexity. They often contained a heady blend of 16 or more ingredients: frankincense, myrrh, juniper, berries, cinnamon, and mint were mixed with honey, raisins, and sweet wine to form a thick, aromatic paste. It was the perfumed love child of an apothecary, a winery, and a confectioner's shop. The creation of kaifi was a ritual in itself. The ingredients weren't just thrown together. They were added in precise phases, sometimes under specific lunar cycles, or accompanied by sacred chants. The sticky, fragrant mixture was left to ferment, allowing the scents to meld and mature before being dried and rolled into small pellets or cones. These pellets were the fuel for the temple's atmosphere, ready to be burned in censers during evening rituals. Its primary function was ritual purification. Priests would wave smoldering dishes of kaifi through the sacred halls of the temple, filling the space with dense, fragrant clouds. The smoke was meant to please the gods and cleanse the space of any negative spiritual energy. It was the ancient equivalent of clearing the air, but on a much more literal and intoxicating level, preparing the minds of the priests and worshippers for divine communication. Now, it's important to remember that most Egyptian temples were vast limestone structures with very poor ventilation. This was intentional, designed to concentrate the sacred atmosphere. Imagine standing in a sealed stone chamber, listening to hypnotic chanting, while a priest fills the room with thick, sweet smoke. In this environment, visions and altered states weren't just possible, they were practically inevitable. Whether it was a true divine message or a touch of oxygen deprivation was a question no one dared to ask. The gods got their tribute either way. But Kaifi's power extended beyond the temple walls. It was considered a potent medicine and a luxury good. The Greek historian Plutarch wrote that it could lull people to sleep, brighten their dreams, and ease their anxieties. The wealthy would burn it in their homes as a kind of high-end air freshener and sleep aid. It was also rolled into pills or mixed with other substances as a remedy for various ailments, blurring the line between spiritual healing and pharmacology. The lingering scent of kaifi became a signature of Egyptian sacred spaces and even their dead. It was burned continuously during the 70-day mummification process, its antimicrobial properties helping to preserve the body, while its divine scent prepared the soul for the afterlife. To the ancient Egyptians, kaifi was the ultimate multi-purpose tool for influencing the unseen world. It was a perfume for the gods, a medicine for mortals, and a bridge between one world and the next, all delivered on a cloud of fragrant smoke. If the Blue Lotus was Egypt's gentle, dreamy friend and kaifi was the sophisticated soul of the temple, then Mandrake was the strange, slightly unhinged guest that you only invited when things needed to get serious. With its peculiar, forked root that often resembled a small, twisted human form, and a reputation that commanded respect and fear, Mandrake was less of an herbal remedy and more of a botanical dare. This was not a plant you trifled with. In the official medical texts, like the famous Eber's Papyrus, Mandrake is listed with a cautious reverence. It was prescribed by priest-physicians as a powerful painkiller, a potent sedative for those with trouble sleeping, and, most curiously, an aphrodisiac. This combination of effects, a substance that could simultaneously put you to sleep and incite passion, is a terrifying concept, highlighting the plant's potent and unpredictable power over the human body and mind. The reason for this caution lies in its chemistry. Mandrake contains powerful tropane alkaloids, namely atropine and scopolamine, compounds that directly interfere with the central nervous system. In very small, carefully controlled doses, it could induce a state of calm or a dreamless sleep, but miscalculate even slightly, and you would be inviting vivid hallucinations, delirium, and night terrors, possibly starring a cast of angry, animal-headed gods who were not pleased to be disturbed. This potent nature gave rise to terrifying folklore about its harvesting. Later legends, likely rooted in these ancient Egyptian associations, claimed that the mandrake root would let out a lethal, blood-curdling scream when pulled from the earth, killing anyone who heard it. The grim solution was to tie a rope from the plant to a dog, plug your own ears, and have the poor animal pull it free, sacrificing the creature to obtain the magical root. While we have no direct proof that the Egyptians were tying plants to dogs, the myth perfectly captures the aura of danger and immense power that surrounded the mandrake. They understood that this was not a simple flower to be sniffed at a banquet. It was a plant with a powerful, almost conscious spirit, one that had to be handled with extreme care, knowledge, and probably a few protective amulets for good measure. Because of its potency, mandrake was likely not part of the common household medicine kit. Its use was probably restricted to trained priests, temple magicians, and physicians who understood the fine line between a healing dose and a fatal one. It may have been used in specific high-stakes rituals, perhaps to induce visions during divination, or in fertility rites where its aphrodisiac qualities were called upon for divine assistance. It was the ultimate double-edged sword in the Egyptian pharmacopoeia. Used with precision, it could ease suffering, bring prophetic sleep, and perhaps even inspire a few lines of sensual poetry. But used recklessly, it was a gateway to madness. One wrong dose, and you wouldn't just have a bad night. You might wake up days later, convinced you had been reborn as a scarab beetle, patiently waiting for someone to roll you into a ball of dung. Somewhere in the vast, dusty archives of Egyptian medical knowledge, scribbled on a papyrus scroll between a cure for crocodile bites and the correct way to place an amulet on an inflamed limb, lies a quiet little mention of a plant called shemshemat. That's right, cannabis. Because when it came to managing pain and sickness in the ancient world, the Egyptians were pragmatists. If divine prayer or magical incantations didn't work, they weren't afraid to reach for something a little more herbal. Cannabis appears in several key medical texts, including the Ebers Papyrus and the Ramesseum III Papyrus, dating back to at least 1550 BCE. It wasn't prescribed for visions or prophecy, but for more earthly concerns. Its primary uses were listed as an anti-inflammatory, a treatment for glaucoma or sore eyes, and most intriguingly, as a remedy for various gynecological complaints. It was a plant of potent, practical healing. That's right, gynecological. The texts suggest that cannabis, often ground and mixed with honey or other substances, was used to ease menstrual pain and assist in childbirth. Some Egyptologists have interpreted the instructions to mean it was administered as a suppository. This would make ancient Egyptian women some of the earliest known users of targeted cannabinoid therapy, a concept that sounds suspiciously like a modern wellness trend you might find on a high-end LA lifestyle blog. The methods of use were varied, but they weren't smoking it in rolled papyrus. At least, not as far as we know. Cannabis was typically prepared by being ground into a paste, infused into oils for topical salves to soothe inflammation on the skin, or blended with other ingredients, like honey, to be taken orally. The goal was always medicinal, to calm, to soothe, to heal. Of course, any smoke produced from burning it as part of a fumigation ritual was likely inhaled, and its effects were surely noted. This inevitably raises the question, was it ever used recreationally? Officially, the evidence is purely medical. Unofficially, let's be realistic. When you're living in 120-degree heat, your drinking water is questionable, and your job involves hauling giant rocks under the watch of a whip-wielding overseer. Nobody is going to blame you for accidentally over-medicating. If the high priest started giggling during a particularly long chant, who was to say it wasn't divine joy rather than an extra strong dose of his glaucoma medication? The physical evidence adds another layer to the mystery. Modern residue analysis, performed on the hair and tissues of some Egyptian mummies has revealed trace amounts of cannabinoids, alongside nicotine and even cocaine, which would have been imported through complex, long-distance trade routes. This discovery has opened up a fascinating debate among historians about the full extent of the ancient Egyptian pharmacopoeia and just how globally connected their substance trade really was. In the end, while cannabis may not have had the glamorous front and center role of the Blue Lotus, it was clearly a respected and utilized tool in the Egyptian medical and, by extension, spiritual toolkit. For the priests, who were also the doctors, the line between healing the body and soothing the spirit was always blurry. Shemet was simply another gift from the gods, a way to bring balance and ease suffering in a world that was often full of it. In the dimly lit, sweet-smelling corners of the temple pharmacy, tucked away behind jars of dried herbs and sacred ointments, sat a particularly potent treasure. It came in the form of small, wrinkled poppy pods, imported from the distant shores of the eastern Mediterranean. This was opium, the ancient world's most powerful painkiller, a divine secret reserved for when the pain was too great, the plague too severe, or the reality of a pyramid-related back injury became too much to bear. The opium poppy was not native to the fertile banks of the Nile. It likely made its debut in Egypt through bustling trade routes with Cyprus and the Levant. Sometime during the New Kingdom, the Egyptians, ever the pragmatists and enthusiastic early adopters of anything effective, quickly recognized the plant's incredible power. Soon, the poppy and its milky latex became a prized commodity, a medical miracle that could bring quiet to the suffering. Its uses were widespread and profound. Opium didn't just dull minor aches. It was powerful enough to smooth over the agony of childbirth. Quiet, relentless coughs, soothe raging gastrointestinal distress, and generally make the chants about cosmic order feel like they actually had a nice, calming beat. It was the ultimate sedative, the pharmaceutical equivalent of a priest placing a hand on your shoulder and whispering, don't worry about it." Naturally, this potent medicine was kept under the careful stewardship of the temple elite. The priests, who doubled as the nation's physicians, administered it for serious ailments, and during intense healing rituals, they would likely offer it to a patient while explaining that it would ease the divine tension in your spleen or calm the chaotic spirits in your heart. Whether the problem was an angry god or an angry molar, opium was often the answer. The ancient texts themselves are characteristically vague. Of course, they don't often use a word we would recognize as opium. Instead, they reference extracts from the poppy plant in the same way a modern food label cryptically mentions natural flavors, a term that is never entirely comforting. But archaeologists are certain the substance they were describing was the powerful sedative derived from Papaver somniferum. And let's not pretend this was all strictly medicinal. In a culture so focused on achieving altered states, there was always a very blurry line between pain relief, spiritual elevation, and a really, really good nap. For the elite, especially those on their final journey, opium may have been part of the funerary send-off. What better way to face the trials of the underworld and the judgment of Osiris than in a state of total, blissful calm, blissfully unaware that a scarab beetle is currently redecorating your nasal cavity? Like so many of Egypt's sacred substances, opium was a delicate balance of cure, comfort, and controlled chaos. Used wisely by a trained priest-physician, it was a miracle that could soothe unimaginable agony. Used poorly, it could turn temple assistants into spaced-out, somnolent background dancers. Still, in a harsh world of primitive dentistry, venomous snakes, and relentless sandstorms, a little bit of sleep-inducing magic went a very, very long way. In the hierarchy of Egyptian beverages, wine was a clear sign of sophistication. It was the drink of the gods, the choice of pharaohs, and a symbol of wealth and status, served in elegant, painted amphorae. But don't let the refined pottery fool you. Egyptian wine could be far more than simple fermented grape juice. It was often a carefully prepared infusion, a complex concoction, and a delivery system for altered consciousness that could hit with the force of a runaway chariot. The Egyptians were masters of the infusion. They treated their wine less like a finished product and more like a liquid canvas, ready to be enhanced. They flavored their vintages with a wide array of additives, from sweet honey and dates to pungent tree resins like myrrh and frankincense. And for special occasions, they reached for more potent ingredients, steeping their wine with blue lotus petals or shavings of mandrake root to create powerful, mood-altering brews. These powerfully spiked wines were the centerpiece of major religious festivals. During events like the Feast of Drunkenness or the beautiful Feast of the Valley, participants weren't sipping their wine to appreciate its subtle notes or terroir. They were chugging it from ceramic cups with the explicit goal of achieving a metaphysical breakthrough. The aim wasn't to feel tipsy, it was to feel disconnected from the mundane world, to teeter on the edge between dimensions while dancing to the beat of a sacred drum. Many of these enhanced wines were even listed in medical texts as remedies, a classification that speaks volumes about their creative approach to pharmacology, suffering from anxiety. Try this vintage infused with calming herbs. Feeling spiritually disconnected? Here's a wine aged with sacred resins to elevate your soul, plagued by a deep, unshakable existential dread. Well, that one probably required priestly supervision and a comfortable floor mat to lie on. This potent liquid therapy wasn't just for mortals, either. The gods themselves were believed to appreciate a good, spiked offering. In temples across Egypt, priests performed daily libation rituals, pouring out vats of the finest infused wines at the feet of divine statues. These offerings were also left in tombs to nourish the deceased in the afterlife, a practice meant to help the divine spirit descend into a statue, or at the very least, to make it wobble in their general direction. Depending on the specific blend of additives, these sacred brews had a wide spectrum of effects. They could calm frayed nerves, ease chronic pain, or launch a respectable midday banquet into the territory of a full-blown psychedelic mystery cult. It was a carefully controlled chemical theater, where the priests were the directors and the wine was the star of the show, capable of delivering a different performance every time. The true genius of the system was that because every sip was part of a sanctioned ritual, no one could truly question the outcome. There were no awkward morning-after conversations about dosages. If you felt euphoric and lightheaded, it was a blessing from Hathor. If the room began to spin gently, the gods were revealing the cyclical nature of the universe. You were in deep and profound divine communion. For the ancient Egyptians, wine was never just a beverage. It was a vehicle. Depending on the skill of the priest who prepared it, that vehicle could take you on a gentle ride to enlightenment, a quick trip to a peaceful sleep, or on a wild journey straight into the arms of a very surprised. For a civilization so utterly obsessed with order, mathematics, and earthly stability. The ancient Egyptians had a surprisingly open and encouraging attitude toward completely losing control. They actively sought out trance states, not as a form of escape, but as a valid and essential form of communication. These altered states of consciousness weren't seen as a mental breakdown. They were seen as a direct and sacred channel to the gods, a hotline to the divine with a bit of static. In fact, what we might view as a medical emergency, they often treated as a religious promotion. Divine possession, where a god or goddess was believed to temporarily inhabit a mortal's body, was the ultimate spiritual honor. If a temple dancer suddenly began convulsing and speaking in a strange voice during a ritual, she wouldn't be rushed to the infirmary. Hathor had just arrived at the party, apparently, and she had some very strong opinions about the tempo of the tambourines. Achieving such a state was a well-practiced art, brought on by a powerful combination of sensory inputs. The recipe for divine trance was a time-honored one. Begin with hours of relentless, hypnotic drumming and rhythmic chanting. Add in prolonged sleep deprivation and fasting. Serve copious amounts of wine that may or may not have mysterious botanicals floating in it. The result was almost guaranteed. The outcomes of these trances were dramatic and varied. They could manifest as sudden bursts of prophecy, with a priestess shouting cryptic warnings about the coming harvest. They might involve dramatic gasping, ecstatic dancing, and speaking in tongues, but spiritually significant, flornap, with the individual collapsing in a heap of divine exhaustion. Priests and priestesses were specifically trained for this, learning how to become gracious hosts for their divine guests. During rituals, they would welcome a god into their body like a celestial tenant, often undergoing a complete change in voice, posture, and personality. Complain that the quality of the offerings had been slipping lately. For the temple staff, it was just another Wednesday. This was how the gods made their will known. The trance state was the delivery mechanism for divine messages, which could range from profound advice on state affairs to scolding the population for their moral failings. Sometimes, the gods simply demanded more cake and beer offerings. Once the divine presence departed, the possessed individual would return to their normal senses, often looking sweaty, disoriented, and utterly drained, like someone waking from a very intense dream. The ritual would conclude with a reverent silence, perhaps another sip of sacred wine to calm the nerves, and a quiet moment of gratitude while an acolyte discreetly mopped up the sanctified drool from the temple floor. To our modern eyes, the spectacle of divine possession might look like a strange mix of performance art, epilepsy, and severe heat stroke, but to the ancient Egyptians, it was the absolute pinnacle of religious experience. It was the sacred moment when the barrier between the mortal and the divine completely dissolved, allowing a god to break through the sandstone walls of reality, just to drop a few cryptic life tips before leaving. You would think that death would be a valid excuse to stop receiving party invitations. Not in ancient Egypt. For the Egyptians, the line between the world of the living and the realm of the dead was less of a solid wall and more of a permeable curtain. They actively included them in their social calendar, proving that a lack of pulse was no reason to miss a good feast. This wasn't a metaphor. During annual celebrations, like the beautiful Feast of the Valley, entire families would pack up baskets of food, jugs of beer, and fresh flowers and make a pilgrimage to the necropolis, the city of the dead. They would set up what looked remarkably like a modern picnic or a tailgate party, right at the entrance of their family tombs. They came to spend the day feasting and drinking with their departed loved ones. The center of this interaction was the false door carved into the tomb's chapel. This wasn't a real entrance, but a magical portal through which the ka, or life spirit of the deceased, could emerge to partake in the essence of the offerings, updating their ancestors on the latest family gossip and hoping that great-grandma appreciated the effort they put into the pickled fish. The belief was that the dead, while in another realm, still had very earthly needs and desires. They could still appreciate the taste of a good beer, the smell of roasted duck, the sound of music, and the warmth of family connection. So, the living provided it all. These tombside gatherings were lively affairs, filled with the sounds of lutes and harps, the thick smoke of incense, and the pouring of libations onto offering tables. It was a beautiful and often emotional scene. The living would get drunk enough to share their deepest fears, confess secrets to their silent ancestors, or weep in remembrance. This was not just an act of memorial, it was a transactional relationship. The living provided sustenance and companionship to the dead. In return, the dead were expected to act as benevolent intermediaries, blessing the living with good harvests, healthy children, and protection from evil spirits and hippo attacks. Some took this connection even further. The practice of incubation involved people sleeping overnight in or near a sacred tomb, hoping to receive guidance or healing from the deceased in their dreams. A son might sleep at his father's tomb, hoping for advice on a business venture, or a woman might pray for a child. You might receive profound wisdom, or perhaps just a spectral reminder from your long-dead accountant to stop lending money to your brother. To our modern sensibilities, having a picnic in a cemetery and talking to a stone wall sounds macabre, if not deeply strange. But to the Egyptians, it was perfectly logical. The afterlife wasn't a final goodbye, it was simply a change of address. And if your great-uncle wanted to attend the annual festival through a process of divine osmosis, who were you to tell him he wasn't welcome? For all the incense, holy trances, and sanctioned overindulgence, ancient Egyptian spiritual life came with a price. That price usually arrived around sunrise, accompanied by a pounding headache, a mouth that tasted like old papyrus, and a vague, fragmented memory of yelling praises at a statue of a baboon. Yes, even in a world where beer was breakfast and flowers could make you float, the morning after hit just as hard. The official hieroglyphic records are suspiciously silent on the subject of hangovers, likely because no scribe was ever in the mood to meticulously chisel detailed symbols when their head felt like it had been personally smited by the sun god Ra. But the evidence is there, tucked away in the less glamorous sections of the medical papyri, which describe cures for what they called pains of the head following a festival. The recommended treatments were varied. A simple case might call for a poultice of herbs and honey applied to the forehead, or perhaps just the simple, timeless advice of lying very still in a dark room while pretending to be deep in prayer. For more advanced cases of divine regret, a full ritual cleansing might be prescribed, which often involved a priest, a bucket of shockingly cold Nile water, and a stern lecture on moderation that nobody could ever remember hearing. The real trick to surviving the morning after, of course, was plausible deniability. This was the genius of their ritual framework. If you had danced shirtless on a temple pylon or passed out in the sacred ibis enclosure, you didn't sheepishly admit that you'd overdone it with the lotus wine. You would solemnly declare that you were overcome by the divine. It wasn't a blackout. It was a profound mystical encounter with the laughter of Hathor. It was far more respectable. For the truly unlucky, whose bodies were staging a full-scale rebellion, there was always the option of purging. The Egyptians were surprisingly fond of emetex, lovely concoctions of salt water or specific herbs designed to help you violently evacuate your sins, often from both ends. Imagine being handed a cup of something that tastes like pure regret and being told, "This will restore your cosmic balance." Moments later, your balance, along with everything else, is definitely gone. Naturally, the experience of the morning after differed by social class. The high priests and priestesses fared better. They had extensive training, ritual authority, and, most importantly, junior acolytes to carry them home and fetch them cool water. The common reveler, meanwhile, would simply wake up in a field with lotus petals tangled in their hair, the imprint of a sandal on their face, and the nagging question of whether they had danced with a god or just a very enthusiastic farmer named Kinemon. And yet, despite the inevitable suffering, no one ever swore off the next celebration. The spiritual enlightenment, the communal joy, and the temporary escape from a harsh world were simply too alluring. As it turns out, the chance to connect with the divine is highly addictive, especially when that connection comes with beer, music, and a mild possibility of falling into a trance and revealing all your neighbor's secrets to a statue. When the ancient Egyptians prepared for death, they didn't just pack a few changes of linen and a well-written eulogy. They packed for a party, a very, very long party. They packed snacks, they packed booze, and they packed their favorite psychoactive substances, just in case eternity got a little monotonous. Because if you thought the revelry stopped once your heart was weighed against a feather, you fundamentally misunderstand the Egyptian worldview. The party just moved underground. Tombs were not designed to be silent, solemn crypts. They were meticulously curated starter homes for the afterlife, fully furnished and stocked for a life of eternal leisure. Mummies were interred with everything they could possibly need, including copious amounts of wine, cones of sacred incense, jars of perfumed oils, and garlands of blue lotus petals. Archaeologists eye the occasional sealed, unlabeled mystery jar with a mixture of reverence and intense professional curiosity. Look at the famous tomb of Tutankhamun. When Howard Carter finally breached its sealed doorway, he didn't just find golden thrones and chariots. He found over 100 baskets of fruit, countless jars of wine, and an impressive collection of botanical and herbal preparations. It was the ancient world's equivalent of a fully stocked pantry and a high-end wellness kit. If a modern celebrity were buried today, the contents would look disturbingly similar, minus the gold-plated canopic jars holding their internal organs. This wasn't just about luxury. It was a matter of strategic, spiritual survival. The soul, or Ba, which they depicted as a human-headed bird, needed constant nourishment and stimulation to thrive in the afterlife. Eternal bliss, it seems, wasn't a passive state, but something that required active maintenance. You couldn't just show up to the field of reeds. You had to arrive with provisions. It was the job of the priests and embalmers to ensure you were sent off with all your spiritual comfort items. They would carefully place offerings of food, perfume, and a generous dose of whatever sacred substance got you through those long, droning temple ceremonies on earth. After all, if it helped you commune with the gods in this life, it was surely essential for rubbing shoulders with them in the next. In some cases, The tombs even included written instructions for the deceased on how to properly prepare and enjoy these items. It's not enough to take a blue lotus with you into eternity. Apparently, you also need a user's manual in case divine short-term memory is an issue. It was a thoughtful, if slightly neurotic, approach to afterlife catering. This all culminated in the opening of the mouth ritual, a crucial ceremony performed on the mummy before the tomb was sealed. Using special instruments, a priest would symbolically touch the mummy's mouth, eyes, and nose, magically restoring the senses for use in the afterlife. This allowed the deceased to eat, speak, see, and, let's be honest, properly enjoy that sacred fermented beverage. It's terribly difficult to offer a toast to Osiris when your jaw has been sealed shut for 3 months. All of this points to one undeniable truth about ancient Egyptian culture. They did not believe in a separation between pleasure and piety. If something brought joy, comfort, or a closer connection to the divine in this life, then it absolutely belonged in your tomb, right next to your magical amulets, your linen headrest, and your personal copy of the Book of the Dead. Ancient Egypt gave the world pyramids, papyrus, and a style of eyeliner that could deflect the desert sun. But it also perfected an unspoken truth of human civilization. Sometimes, the people running the show are operating in a slightly altered state of mind, just convinced enough by their own visions to believe everything is going according to plan. And in Egypt, there were 2 seats of power, the pharaoh and the priests who held the keys to the sacred medicine cabinet. Officially, the pharaoh was the living embodiment of the god Horus, the divine shepherd tasked with maintaining Mat, the cosmic principle of order, truth, and justice. Unofficially, it was the temple priests who controlled the incense budget, held the secret recipes for psychoactive wine, and decided who got to chant next to a smoldering bowl of kaifi until they saw the face of a god in the smoke. The religious elite weren't just spiritual advisors. They were the state-sanctioned pharmacists of the entire nation. They supplied the populace with everything from simple healing salves to full-blown psychedelic experiences, carefully disguised as Holy Communion. If a substance smelled strong, tingled on contact, or made you speak only in metaphors for 3 days straight, it almost certainly came from the priesthood's well-stocked apothecary. This monopoly on divine chemistry gave them an almost incalculable amount of soft power. While the pharaoh wore the double crown and wielded the crook and flail, it was the priests who knew how to correctly dose a mandrake infusion without accidentally sending a court official on a one-way trip to the underworld. This specialized knowledge made them not just respected, but absolutely essential to the functioning of the state. Their influence was profound, allowing them to manage the mystical and emotional pulse of society. You didn't ask a government official for a harvest forecast. You asked the temple, what did the high priest see in his trance last night? The answer, more often than not, involved a divine falcon, a lot of swirling golden light, and the assurance that the gods were pleased, provided the offerings continued to flow. And the offerings did flow because the temples were massive economic engines. They were some of the largest landowners and employers in Egypt, and they were also major centers of agricultural and pharmaceutical production. Blue lotus flowers didn't magically harvest themselves. It took a dedicated workforce to grow them, dry them, and prepare them according to sacred verse. Religion was holy, but it was also a very well-oiled machine, one that ran on faith, grain, and carefully administered doses of divine inspiration. In many ways, the perpetual question of who truly ruled Egypt was less about the person on the throne and more about who controlled the incense burners. If the gods only spoke through visions, and the visions only came after a priest inhaled something pungent in a sealed stone chamber, well, you can do the math. The one who interprets the divine message is the one who holds the real power. In theory, ancient Egypt was all about balance, justice, and universal cosmic order. In practice, if you were wealthy enough to own a private tomb and employ someone to fan you with an ostrich feather while you digested your lunch, you also had access to the good stuff. Make no mistake, ancient Egyptian society was a rigid hierarchy, and its mind-altering substances followed the exact same pyramid structure as everything else. Pharaoh at the top, peasant at the bottom. While the common laborer, toiling away on a temple construction site, got their daily ration of thick, chewy barley beer and maybe a faint, second-hand whiff of kaifi smoke if they stood downwind from the sanctuary. The experience of the elite was entirely different. Nobles and high officials were metaphorically, and perhaps literally, bathing in Blue Lotus oil and sipping wine delicately spiked with imported spices from gold-rimmed chalices. Theirs was a first-class ticket to the divine. The most potent substances in the Egyptian pharmacopoeia, the rare mandrake root, the complex 16-ingredient kaifi blends, and any imported cannabis or opium resins, were likely restricted for use in high-level rituals or serious medical treatments. And, funnily enough, these exclusive uses just so happened to align perfectly with the daily schedules and occasional ailments of court officials and the high priesthood. Take the pharaoh himself, the divine ruler of the two lands. He couldn't possibly be expected to process the immense metaphysical weight of his office without a little assistance from the sacred apothecary. If the king's dreams were considered direct messages from the gods that could influence state policy, then ensuring he had a peaceful, vision-filled sleep with a specially prepared psychoactive nightcap wasn't an indulgence. It was a matter of national security. This spiritual class divide extended even into death. The tombs of the elite were packed with their private stashes, ensuring their privileged access continued into eternity. The wine jars and medicinal vials found in these tombs often bear vague labels, like for ceremonial use, which one can imagine was the ancient Egyptian equivalent of winking at the gods, while saying you only read certain magazines for the articles. Meanwhile, for the lower classes, the experience was vastly different. They had their beer, their communal festivals, and their simple faith. But if a common field laborer was caught with a restricted substance, like mandrake, without the temple's permission, it wouldn't be seen as a quest for spiritual enlightenment. It would be called black magic, heresy, or simply a very, very bad day to be caught by the local authorities. So while divine communion was theoretically available to all, the quality and intensity of that communion depended heavily on your social standing. The path to enlightenment was open, but the premium package, the one with the best views and the luxury amenities, was reserved for those who could afford it in both this life and the next. After this long journey through sacred wines, divine trances, and hallucinogenic healthcare, we have to ask the final question: what does all of this really tell us about the ancient Egyptians? Beyond the novelty of it all, what is the deeper truth hidden in the smoke and sediment of their sacred cups? For starters, it reveals their unique genius for blending what we now consider separate fields. Science, spirituality, and recreational chemistry were all part of a single, unified belief system. It shows that for the Egyptians, medicine and mysticism were not opposites. They were two sides of the same coin. A flower could be both a cure for pain and a vehicle for prophecy. An intoxicating drink could be both a prescription for anxiety and a required sacrament for a holy festival. They saw no contradiction in this, understanding that the body, mind, and spirit were inextricably linked, and that healing one often meant treating them all. This journey also reveals just how much the ancients respected and even revered the power of altered states of consciousness. They didn't see these experiences as a form of escapism or a dangerous loss of control. To them, it was a legitimate and essential pathway to accessing deeper insight, profound healing, and, of course, direct communication with the occasional god who happened to have the head of a crocodile and a flair for dramatic entrances. Of course, it also tells a story about power, the strict gatekeeping of the most potent sacred substances was the ancient world's version of putting wellness behind a paywall. The elite had their private Blue Lotus gardens and their imported opium resins, ensuring their direct line to the divine was always clear. Everyone else got the more diluted experience: lukewarm beer, second-hand incense, smoke, and an abiding faith that the gods could hear them anyway. But perhaps the most human and revealing takeaway is this: people have always sought to feel more, see more, and understand more about the mysteries of existence, especially if the path to that understanding involves lying down in a quiet temple and not having to do chores. The ancient Egyptians, with their sacred flowers and ritual drinks, weren't so different from modern humans meditating with essential oils or listening to calming history podcasts to fall asleep. They were simply using the tools they had. So maybe we should see them not as primitive substance users or eccentric spiritualists, but as a deeply sophisticated people doing their best to navigate a confusing, beautiful, and often painful world. They used ritual, chemistry, and faith to find meaning and balance. And if that journey to inner peace happened to involve a trance where you felt like you could speak to the gods, so be it. Thank you for joining us on this journey down the Nile. We hope it has been a relaxing and insightful one. If you've enjoyed our exploration, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Medieval Nocturnes for more quiet trips into history. We'd love to know what you found most surprising about the ancient Egyptians. Now, as we leave the warm sands of Egypt behind, our story is far from over. Let the current of time carry us forward to a different world, one of art, intrigue, and its own peculiar brand of beautiful poison. We find ourselves now in Florence, in the late 1400s. The air here is thick with the scent of incense from the Duomo, the sweat of artists hauling marble, and the sweet perfume of crushed roses. This is the heart of the Renaissance, a city bursting with groundbreaking art, fierce intellect, and deadly political intrigue. But beneath the surface of this rebirth of culture was a very specific kind of madness, the obsession with beauty, and not just any beauty, the kind that demanded you look like a living porcelain statue, even if it killed you. The ultimate aesthetic goal for a noble woman of the Renaissance was a complexion of pure, luminous white. In a world where tanned skin was the unmistakable mark of a peasant who labored under the sun, looking as pale as a ghost was the ultimate status symbol. It signaled a life of leisure, wealth, and refinement. It meant you were untouched by the grit and struggle of the common world. To be beautiful was to be ethereal, and to be ethereal was to look as if you were already halfway to the afterlife. To achieve this coveted, deathly pallor, women turned to a luxurious, silky white face paint known as Venetian cerussa, or simply cerussa. It provided a flawless matte finish that shimmered in the candlelight of a Florentine palazzo. It was also made almost entirely of white lead. Yes, actual, toxic lead. Women across Italy and beyond would eagerly smear this shimmering poison across their faces, necks, and chests to achieve that perfect, otherworldly glow. This wasn't just a light dusting of powder. Achieving the look required layering the cerussa on like Venetian stucco, creating a thick, artificial mask of nobility. Some of the most dedicated followers of fashion would even sleep in their lead makeup, reapplying it for days or weeks at a time, refusing to wash their faces to preserve the precious white coating. All the while, the toxic compound was literally soaking into their skin and bloodstream. The results were, at first, radiant. The lead paint gave a ghostly, luminous quality to the skin. That is, right up until the inevitable side effects began to appear. Skin lesions, hair loss, muscle paralysis, and severe damage to the internal organs. But the horrifying irony was in the solution. When the lead caused sores and blemishes, the accepted practice was simply to apply an even thicker layer of cerussa to cover them up. It was a Renaissance band-aid that guaranteed the wound would never, ever heal. And if the lead didn't get you, the mercury might. Mercury-based lotions were a popular treatment for removing blemishes and fading freckles, adding another layer of heavy metal poison to the daily routine. Combine this with arsenic-laced tonics meant to purify the blood and harsh vinegar baths to tighten the skin, and you had a full-blown chemical warfare regimen being marketed as high fashion. Perhaps the most tragic part of this pursuit was the sheer commitment to the aesthetic. The same noblewomen who were slowly poisoning themselves with lead and mercury also had access to the world's finest ported perfumes from the Orient and fragrant rosewater distillations. They literally smelled like angels, all while their skin was peeling off in sheets beneath their perfumed gloves. Looking divine, it turned out, came at a truly divine cost. If you possessed a full natural set of eyebrows in Renaissance Florence, you clearly weren't trying hard enough. In the relentless quest to look like a Botticelli painting or a particularly fashionable egg, Renaissance women took the concept of grooming to a whole new level of painful subtraction. The face, once powdered into a pale leaden mask, was not yet complete. Next, the height of fashion, quite literally, was a high, rounded, and completely bare forehead. This was considered the ultimate sign of intelligence, piety, and aristocratic grace. The more expansive the forehead, the more noble and contemplative you appeared. To achieve this look, women would painstakingly pluck, tweeze, and shave their natural hairlines, sometimes removing inches of hair to create a perfect, sweeping dome. This was not a one-time affair, but a constant, agonizing ritual of maintenance. Rows of hair were yanked out with rough tweezers, coarse cloth, or even the sharp edge of a seashell. It was a weekly routine of pain and precision, all in the name of looking more cerebral. For any stubborn hairs that dared to grow back, some women would rub on caustic concoctions made from walnut oil, or, according to some texts, cat dung and vinegar, which was believed to inhibit regrowth. And the pursuit of a bare face didn't stop there. Eyebrows were seen as a vulgar, almost animalistic feature. A truly sophisticated woman had them plucked into oblivion, leaving either a very thin, highly arched line, or, even better, no brow at all. A soft shadow might be painted back on later, often using burnt cork or powdered charcoal, which sounds elegant until you remember that it would smear terribly in the Florentine heat. Imagine trying to look pious during Mass while your eyebrows are slowly dripping down your cheeks. This wore on hair extended below the brow. Any visible body hair was considered unclean and common. Women would remove it using a depilatory paste that was, predictably, another charming and toxic blend. The recipe often called for quicklime, arsenic, and vinegar, a mixture that would burn the hair away, and often a layer of skin right along with it. But hey, at least you were smooth for a few days. Meanwhile, the hair that was allowed to remain on the head was subjected to its own torturous regime. It was bleached with lye to achieve the fashionable golden hue of the season, then braided and twisted into tight, rigid styles. These elaborate updos were often padded with false hair made from wool, silk, or sometimes horsehair, creating immense and heavy structures that required dozens of pins to hold in place. Perhaps the most astounding fact in all of this is that most women performed these delicate operations without a mirror. High-quality glass mirrors were a rare and exorbitant luxury. Most grooming was done by feel, or with the assistance of a trusted servant. You had to hope your lady's maid had steady hands and absolutely no passive-aggressive tendencies. One wrong move, and your fashionable widow's peak could quickly become a monk's tonsure. Renaissance beauty, it seems, was as much about faith as it was about fashion. Once the face had been thoroughly powdered with poison, the hairline plucked into submission, and the eyebrows erased in the name of nobility, it was time to address the body. Specifically, the task was to squeeze the female torso into a shape that the human ribcage had absolutely no business aspiring to. To accomplish this feat of anatomical defiance, Renaissance women turned to their most powerful and punishing tool, the corset. These early corsets, more accurately called stays, or a pair of bodies, were not quite the hourglass cinching death traps of the later Victorian era, but they still meant business. Their primary goal was not to create a tiny waist, but to flatten the torso into a stiff, inverted cone. The ideal was a smooth, rigid canvas that pushed the bust up and out, creating an elongated, almost architectural silhouette. After all, what could be more alluring than looking like a very elegant, well-dressed plank? The materials used for stiffening were a clear indicator of social class. If you were wealthy, your stays were reinforced with slats of expensive and flexible whalebone. If you were of a lesser station, they were stiffened with dried reeds, wood, or even thick layers of pasteboard glued together. All of it was sewn into a heavy linen casing and laced tightly, usually up the back, by a servant with strong hands and a great deal of patience. Getting into one of these contraptions required assistance, a deep sense of determination, and a surprising tolerance for losing your peripheral vision as the pressure built. A fully dressed noblewoman was essentially an armored artichoke, layered, structured, and strangely delicate. Every movement was deliberate, every breath was shallow, and turning your head required moving your entire upper body as a single, rigid unit. But these stays were more than just a fashion statement. They were a moral one. A straight, unbending, upright posture was seen as an outward reflection of inner virtue and discipline. Slouching, on the other hand, was a sign of moral laxity, laziness, and possibly even a susceptibility to demonic possession. So, if you were a well-bred lady, you stood straight, you walked stiffly, and you learned to breathe in short, ladylike gasps. This restricted breathing, combined with the heat and the weight of heavy gowns, is why fainting was so common. Fainting gracefully in public wasn't just a dramatic trope, it was a regular occurrence. In fact, it was often seen as a sign of extreme sensitivity and refinement. If you passed out from the pressure of your corset, it just meant you were doing it right. You were truly committed to the aesthetic. And yet, for all the discomfort, the stays had one undeniable benefit. They offered the kind of structural reinforcement usually reserved for cathedral architecture. Unlike modern undergarments that often feel like a gentle suggestion, a Renaissance corset held everything firmly in place. You could ride a horse, survive a courtly dance, or endure a fainting spell without a single thing shifting an inch. It was fashion as engineering, with the female body as the foundation. In Renaissance Italy, beauty wasn't just a state of being. It was a continuous, demanding performance. And that performance extended all the way to the dinner table, where the worlds of high fashion and high cuisine collided in a very uncomfortable and restrictive way. On the one hand, noble women were expected to attend lavish, hours-long banquets and participate in the grand social theater of the feast. On the other, they had to do it while laced into a corset so tight their internal organs had essentially become unwilling roommates. Meals for the nobility were spectacular affairs. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted peacocks presented with their feathers reattached, enormous marzipan sculptures, and glistening gilded fruits. Yet, for the upper-class woman, actually consuming this food was a masterclass in deception. You could nibble politely, you could sip wine delicately, but you absolutely could not unhinge your jaw and go to town on a roasted goose leg that would have been seen as barbaric and, given the whalebone in your bodice, potentially life-threatening. Instead, a lady was expected to take the most dainty, bird-like bites, all while keeping her back perfectly straight and maintaining a pleasant, serene smile, even as the pressure in her ribs mounted with every sip of wine. Sometimes, the sheer effort of sitting upright for hours and pretending to enjoy cold eel pie was enough to trigger one of those fashionable fainting spells. Frankly, passing out was often a welcome interruption to the performance. Of course, this polite, public self-starvation had its limits. Many noble women were secretly ravenous by the time the banquet concluded, and they could retreat to their private chambers. There, once the corset was finally unlaced, they could devour a hidden stash of sweetmeats, cheese, or leftover pastries that a sympathetic servant had saved for them. Yes, even the most ethereal Renaissance beauties had midnight snacks. They just couldn't admit it in public. Adding to the pressure, there were even rules about which foods were considered beautiful. Certain foods were believed to directly affect the complexion and were to be avoided. Cucumbers, for instance, were thought to make the skin watery and pale in an unattractive way. Red wine, however, was encouraged, as it brought a delicate, desirable flush to the cheeks. Some women even drank vinegar-based tonics between meals to stay trim, willingly ruining their gut lining in the name of a fashionable silhouette. Then there was the simple, mechanical problem of digestion. When wearing a corset, your stomach has nowhere to expand. Even a small meal could lead to indigestion, bloating, or, heaven forbid, a very unladylike burp, which would have been a social catastrophe. Women had to pace themselves with extreme care, mastering the art of eating just enough to seem sociable, but never enough to risk a breach of etiquette or a split seam. So, while the men at the banquet could recline, drink heavily, and engage in loud, boisterous arguments about Dante and politics. The women beside them perfected the art of elegant restraint. They became masters of looking nourished while being quietly starved. Another small, painful sacrifice laid at the altar of Renaissance beauty. Once the face was painted, the hair plucked, the body laced into an unbending column, and the food politely nibbled, it was time for the final invisible layer of armor. It was time to smell expensive. In Renaissance Florence, your personal fragrance wasn't just a pleasant afterthought. It was a declaration of your status, a social weapon, and a meticulously curated statement. Failing to smell like imported luxury was not just a faux pas. It was practically a scandal. The Renaissance nose had very high standards, and it lived in a world of extreme olfactory contrasts. The common folk on the street might reek of garlic, unwashed wool, goat, and a general air of existential dread. But the elite, they wafted through salons and basilicas, trailing fragrant clouds of rosewater, musk, civet, and exotic spices. If a duchess walked past you, and you didn't feel at least mildly intoxicated by her scent, she simply wasn't trying hard enough. Perfume was big business, and Venice was the European hub for the most coveted ingredients, which were sourced from the farthest corners of the known world. Frankincense came from Arabia, myrrh from Ethiopia, and cinnamon from Ceylon. But the most prized ingredient of all was ambergris, a waxy, strangely pleasant-smelling substance harvested from the digestive system of sperm whales. It was outrageously expensive, wildly fashionable, and the absolute pinnacle of luxury fragrance. These perfumes weren't just dabbed sparingly onto the wrists. They were soaked into fine leather gloves, stitched into the linings of dresses, and sprayed liberally onto handkerchiefs. A lady would carry one of these scented handkerchiefs at all times, ready to be fluttered dramatically in front of her nose whenever someone less hygienic came too close, which, in a Renaissance city, was often. In an era of filthy streets, open sewers, and irregular bathing, perfume wasn't really a luxury, it was a necessity. It was a form of personal armor, a fragrant shield against the overwhelming miasma of daily life. For the truly ambitious beauty, scent layering was an essential part of the daily ritual, a complex process that began with a scented bath of rosewater or chamomile. After bathing, a noblewoman might be dusted with powdered violet or iris root. Then, a scented oil or paste would be rubbed into the temples and wrists. Some even wore pomanders, which were delicate, perforated orbs made of silver or gold, filled with aromatic herbs and spices. These would be worn on a chain around the neck or dangled from the waist like an olfactory warning bell, signaling to all that you were approaching with an aura of cinnamon and quiet judgment. However, these powerful potions weren't always benign. Some perfumes contained harsh ingredients like turpentine or tinctures, so potent they could trigger headaches, dizziness, or even fainting spells. One wrong blend from your apothecary and your carefully crafted aura could quickly go from seductive to simply insufferable. Still, in the high-stakes theater of the Renaissance court, the right fragrance was a powerful tool. It could entice, distract, and command respect, all without saying a single word. If Renaissance beauty was a battlefield, then fashion was the armor, and Florence was its glittering, fabric-draped war zone. The gown a noble woman wore didn't just say something about her, it screamed. It sang an opera of social standing. It flounced down the cobblestone streets, loudly declaring her family's wealth, her husband's political rank, and whether or not she had any shame about bankrupting him for a particularly ostentatious sleeve. Velvet was the crown jewel of the textile world. It was thick, heavy, shimmering, and absurdly expensive, often imported and dyed with the kind of painstaking care usually reserved for a sacred relic. To wear a gown of deep crimson or sapphire velvet, especially in the oppressive heat of a Florentine summer, was the ultimate power move. You were hot, yes, but more importantly, you were rich enough to ignore the weather. If velvet was a statement, then brocade was an entire woven narrative. Not content with mere color, brocade brought intricate patterns into the picture, often woven with real gold or silver thread. These weren't subtle floral prints. Gowns were adorned with roaring lions, twisting vines, family crests, and even entire religious scenes. A particularly pious duchess might wear a gown depicting the Annunciation, turning her torso into a walking altarpiece. And then there were the sleeves. In Renaissance fashion, sleeves were not permanently attached to the bodice. They were separate, interchangeable pieces, tied on with ribbons. This practical feature quickly evolved into a competitive sport. Wealthy women owned entire wardrobes of sleeves to mix and match with their gowns, flaunting them like today's designer handbags. They could be puffed, slashed, to reveal the fabric underneath, embroidered with pearls, or so elaborate they required their own storage system. The colors of these fabrics were a language in themselves. Deep, vibrant blues were made from powdered lapis lazuli, a semi-precious stone. Rich crimsons came from the cochineal beetle. These pigments were incredibly rare and expensive, and their use was often restricted by sumptuary laws, which attempted, and usually failed, to reserve certain colors for the nobility. But laws were for commoners, a truly powerful family dressed in whatever color they pleased. Even the hidden layers of an outfit were ornate. The linen chemise worn underneath would be trimmed with fine lace at the collar and cuffs. Layers of petticoats, designed to give the skirt its voluminous shape, would be made of silk that might flash for a moment as a lady walked. Even the girdle, a decorative belt worn at the waist, was often studded with gems and might contain hidden pockets for a prayer book, a pomander, or perhaps a secret revenge note. All of this opulence came at a staggering price. A single formal gown could easily cost more than a skilled craftsman earned in an entire year. And yet, for a noblewoman, these gowns weren't a luxury. They were a necessity. Every wedding, banquet, and religious festival was a stage, and every outfit was a critical performance. In this world, to wear the same gown twice two major events was considered a social catastrophe. Renaissance fashion didn't stop at the ankle. In fairness, though, no one was really supposed to see your ankles. Modesty and the sheer volume of fabric in a noblewoman's gown dictated that her feet be kept decently hidden from view. This was a pity, really, considering that the footwear of the era was often one of the most completely and wonderfully ridiculous parts of the entire outfit. Let's begin in Venice, home of the most theatrical shoe ever invented, the chapine. Chapines were essentially high platform soles, like ancient Roman sandals, had a strange and very tall child with a pair of stilts. Their original purpose was practical, to elevate a lady and her priceless velvet gown several inches above the mud, filth, and plague-infested waters of the Venetian streets. But, as always happens with fashion, function soon gave way to a competitive spectacle. Over time, chapines got taller and taller and taller. Some surviving examples are over 20 inches high. That is not a typo. 20 inches. Wearing them was less like walking and more like a high-wire act, requiring incredible balance, extensive training, and more often than not, a servant on each arm just to stay upright. Walking unassisted in a pair of chopines was considered both a remarkable physical feat and a serious social risk. If you fell, you didn't just lose your dignity. You might create a domino effect, taking out half the wedding party with you. The sound of a noble woman clattering to the flagstones was a sound of both comedy and pure, unadulterated terror for anyone standing nearby. In Florence, the trend was slightly less extreme, but the principle of impracticality remained. Wealthy women wore delicate, pointed slippers called pianelle, often crafted from the same luxurious velvet as their gowns, embroidered with silk thread and lined with soft fur. These were strictly indoor shoes. For venturing outside, you would wear pattens, sturdy wooden or cork platforms that were strapped on underneath your delicate slippers to protect them from the street. The pressure to have small, dainty, narrow feet was immense, even if they were hidden. Shoes were painfully pointed and not designed for the mechanics of an actual human foot. But who needed to walk when you could be carried from a sedan chair to a palace hall in a seamless, gliding motion? The goal was to appear as if you floated, unburdened by the gritty reality of touching the ground. And we mustn't forget the stockings. Women wore finely knit hose made of silk or wool, which were held up by tying decorative ribbons or garters around the knee. In a final touch of sensory overkill, these ribbons were sometimes scented with perfume, because, on the off chance that a gentleman caught a scandalous glimpse of your shin as you stepped into a carriage, you at least wanted that shin to smell fabulous. It all reinforced a single, powerful message. Real ladies didn't walk, they floated, they glided, and they suffered, gracefully and in impeccable style, from head to toe. After all the hours of being powdered, plucked, laced, perfumed, stuffed, and propped up on platforms, what came next? That's right, dancing. Because nothing completes the arduous ritual of Renaissance beauty quite like trying to glide gracefully across a polished marble floor, while wearing 20 pounds of fabric and operating on about 2 inches of breathable lung space. This was the final exam, and it was pass or fail. Courtly dances were serious, serious business. This was not a carefree, tavern-style reel where you could let your hair down. No, Renaissance court dances were slow, stately, and excruciatingly choreographed. Every single step was rehearsed, every gesture was symbolic, and every turn was laden with social meaning. One wrong foot placement could imply a lack of proper breeding. A clumsy misstep was scandalous. For the noblewoman, the dance was the ultimate test of her composure and endurance. The most popular forms, like the slow, processional pavin, or the slightly more energetic galliard with its little hops, required gliding in precise geometric patterns. All the while, you had to keep your gaze modestly lowered and never, under any circumstances, breathe through your mouth. That was considered undignified, which is unfortunate, because the corset did not allow for deep, calming breaths through the nose. This is why a woman's grace on the dance floor was considered as vital to her family's reputation as her dowry. Wealthy parents hired dance tutors for their daughters with the same intensity that modern parents might hire sat prep coaches. You had to learn how to turn, how to bow, and how to flutter your fan just enough to seem mysterious, but not so much that you looked like you were sweating. The ultimate goal was to radiate an aura of complete and effortless control. even as your pointed slippers were blistering your feet and your ribs were sending out distress signals. You had to create the perfect illusion that you were a celestial being, floating through the steps, completely unbothered by the physical reality of your restrictive clothing. The dance floor was also a rare opportunity for strategic social interaction. It was one of the few places where a young, unmarried woman could interact briefly with an eligible man. Gloved hands might touch for a fleeting moment during a turn. Eyes might meet over a low bow. A witty comment could be whispered. It was flirtation with extensive footnotes and a chaperone watching your every move. But you had to be careful. Say too much, move too boldly, or, heaven forbid, laugh with genuine, unrestrained joy, and you risked shattering your entire aesthetic of pious, untouchable elegance. The air was thick with a choir of silent judgment. Other women critiqued your gown, your hairstyle, your posture. Tutors fretted from the sidelines, and all the while you had to smile, glide, and endure, until the music finally stopped and you could excuse yourself to go repowder your sweat-streaked lead makeup before the next dance began. The guests have finally departed. The last of the candles have melted into waxy puddles on their silver stands, and the Renaissance noblewoman, dazzling, divine, and delicately dying inside, at last makes it back to the privacy of her bedchamber. But sleep was not yet an option. First came the arduous process of dismantling the masterpiece. This was the Renaissance night routine, and it was less about self-care and more about controlled deterioration. Step 1 was the great unmasking. A servant would bring linen cloths, a bowl of rose water, and sometimes raw egg whites or almond oil. The thick, lead-based cerussa had to be gently coaxed from the skin, not scrubbed, because scrubbing too hard would take irritated skin right along with it. With every wipe, the lady would hope that her own complexion underneath wasn't too ravaged by the poison she had worn all day. Spoiler alert. Next came the hair, or what was left of it, after a lifetime of plucking. The heavy, elaborate hairstyle had to be carefully uncoiled, pin by painful pin. Any false braids or pads made of wool or horsehair were removed. Any sticky adhesives used to keep a forehead wig in place had to be dissolved with herbal tonics, all while hoping that the caustic hair removal creams used earlier in the week hadn't left any new and unfortunate bald patches. Then came the most anticipated moment of the evening, the unlacing of the corset. This was a spiritual experience, a moment of profound physical release that usually involved a great deal of quiet gasping, groaning, and possibly an audible crunch as the ribcage expanded back to its original shape. For the first time in perhaps 16 hours, the noble woman could take a full, deep breath. Her feet were then carefully peeled out of their pointed velvet slippers, often revealing the crushed and blistered remains of what used to be toes. If she was lucky, her servant would bring a warm basin of water infused with lavender or rosemary to soak away the aches. If not, she would simply stare at her own feet and quietly wonder if she would ever feel joy again. Finally, before slipping into her nightgown, she would be rubbed down with sweet-smelling oils to moisturize her tormented skin. Or, if she was particularly paranoid about aging, she might use an alchemical tonic that promised to preserve her youth. Never mind that it smelled like old copper and probably contained powdered beetles. Beauty is pain, but in the Renaissance, it was also possibly pestilence. At long last, the candle would be blown out, not with an improper huff, but a delicate, apologetic puff of air. The noblewoman would lie back in her bed, her hairline 2 inches farther back than it was a year ago, her skin a little more ghostly than the day before, and her lungs slowly recovering from the trauma of the corset. And she would rest, knowing that tomorrow she would wake up and do it all over again. Because in Renaissance Florence, beauty was a full-time, high-stakes performance with no intermission. Our long journey tonight has taken us from the perfumed banks of the Nile to the incense-filled courts of Florence. We've seen how, across cultures and centuries, humanity has used substances, rituals, and pain to seek beauty, status, and a connection to something greater than themselves. These stories, often hidden in the margins of history, remind us that the past is a far stranger and more complex place than we can ever imagine. Thank you for spending this quiet time with us here at Medieval Nocturnes. We hope this story has been a peaceful and interesting companion as you drift toward sleep. If you enjoyed our journey, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support allows us to continue unearthing these forgotten tales. Until next time, we wish you a very pleasant and restful night.